two at a time. Once I reached the top, I pushed the basement door shut and jammed the padlock's broken piece back in place. My breath came in frantic bursts. My skin was damp with sweat. I felt a pounding headache behind my eyes. I made my way to my room as fast as possible. I locked the door, sank onto the bed, and tried to slow my breathing. My head was spinning with questions. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear my thoughts. My pulse kept racing. At some point, I dozed off, only to wake up to that same dull knocking. It felt like it was right inside my head. My chest tightened, and my stomach churned. Now, every time I hear that knocking, I think of that metal cylinder pulsing in my hand. My ears still ring when I remember the vibration. I can't figure out what it is or why it's down there. The owner never explained. I'm not even sure she knows exactly what she's hiding. But each night I lie here and stare at the ceiling, listening for the next thump, the next whisper. Sometimes I catch myself turning off the lamp and walking into the hallway, as if I'm drawn to it without meaning to be. The nightmares haven't stopped. In them I see that small room, that metal cabinet, and the cylinder's glow. I see my own hand wrapped around it, unable to let go. Tonight is my last night at this inn. The knock is starting again, slow and steady. My skin prickles and I feel my pulse hammering. I keep telling myself to ignore it, but my body feels on high alert, like I'm in a constant state of panic. I don't know if I'll ever sleep properly again. Even if I leave tomorrow, I'll carry this feeling with me. Part of me wants to run out of here right now, but another part of me is thinking about going back down, just to see if the door is still open and if the cylinder is still there. I can't decide. My hands won't stop shaking. I can hear the owner pacing around downstairs. Every so often her footsteps stop and I wonder if she's listening to that sound too. Maybe she's known about this for a long time. Maybe she's tried to destroy it but couldn't. I don't know, and I don't think she'll tell me. All I know is that I feel trapped in this place, even though I can walk out anytime. I sit here on the bed, listening to my ragged breathing and the faint bumps under the floor. It's cold. My body feels stiff, and my heart won't settle down. The flashlight is on the nightstand, pointed at the door. I'm scared to turn it off. My mouth is dry, and I keep rubbing my arms, trying to warm up. The sound from below won't stop. It's like a heartbeat that's just out of sync with mine. I'm counting the minutes until dawn, hoping I don't lose my nerve. If the door to the basement stays closed, maybe I can slip away at first light. But I'm not sure if I'll ever really leave this place behind. I never believed in haunted houses, but I also never spent much time alone in a place with a bad reputation. When I showed up at that old man just looking for a quiet spot to stay, a friend of mine had given me the key. He told me it belonged to an old family in town and that nobody lived there anymore. He didn't say much else, and I didn't bother asking. I just wanted a roof over my head while I took care of a job in the area. I pulled up in my truck on a cloudy afternoon. The driveway was a strip of gravel that crunched under my tires. The house stood at the end of the property. Tall windows, chipped paint on the walls, and a front door that looked warped from age. I remember the sky was gray, and the wind was cold enough that I felt it in my bones the moment I stepped out. I carried my bag up the front steps. The boards creaked under my boots. There was a feeling in the air that made me uneasy, like the house was holding its breath, waiting to see who had arrived. I tried the key, and it turned easily. Inside, the foyer was dark. I saw old wooden floors, dusty portraits on the walls, and a wide staircase ahead of me. The place smelled like old furniture and stale air. It wasn't pleasant, but I kept telling myself I would only be here a few weeks. I flipped a few light switches near the door, but only one worked. A dim light bulb and a hanging fixture flickered overhead. It didn't do much to chase away the shadows in the corners. I dragged my bag into a room on the ground floor that looked like a sitting room. There were two large armchairs facing each other, and a small table between them. Everything was coated in dust. My eyes stung from it. When I breathed in, I felt like I was inhaling decades of neglect. I coughed a few times and decided to open a window. The window slid open with a groan, and a blast of cold air rushed in, making me shiver. As I looked outside, I noticed the yard was pretty overgrown. Tall grass, an old tree with twisted branches, no sign of life. I tried not to think about how run down everything looked. I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the ground floor, looking for the kitchen, a bathroom, and the circuit breaker. The hallways felt chilly, and I couldn't figure out if the heating system was broken or if the place just retained a permanent cold. Whenever I paused, I had the strange sense that something was moving nearby. I checked over my shoulder a few times, but I never saw anything. The furniture seemed to be where I left it, though I did notice an old coat rack that hadn't been in one corner the first time I walked by. I told myself I must have just missed it. Later, I found the breaker box in a laundry room. I flicked a few switches, but the wiring seemed ancient and only a few lights came on around the house. I decided to keep my flashlight and a few spare batteries with me just in case. I also found a dusty bedroom upstairs. It wasn't much, but it had a bed and a dresser. I put my clothes away and set up a small lamp. The bed creaked when I sat down to test the mattress. At least it was better than sleeping on the floor. That first night I had trouble sleeping. Around midnight I heard something in the hallway. It sounded like soft footsteps. My heart thumped in my chest. I sat up in bed, listening. The steps seemed to move slowly, like someone was pacing back and forth. I got out of bed and walked to the door. I opened it a crack. The hallway was dark, and the only light came from my lamp behind me. I stepped out, holding my breath, but the hallway was empty. The floor felt cold under my bare feet. My hands were shaking a bit from the tension. After a minute, the footsteps stopped. I waited another few seconds. Then I went back to bed, telling myself the house was old and probably settled. I didn't believe it, but it was the only explanation I had. The next day, I woke up stiff and tired. I decided to clean up a bit, try to make the place more livable. I spent the morning dusting some of the furniture and sweeping the floors. Every so often, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my vision, a shift in the shadows near a chair, or a curtain that flickered when the windows were closed. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, it made me uneasy, and I rushed through my chores with sweat forming on my forehead. By late afternoon, I needed a break. I sat in the foyer on one of those old chairs, drinking water from a plastic bottle. That's when I heard a faint whisper. I looked around, thinking maybe a draft of wind was blowing through a crack in the wall. The whisper seemed to come from the direction of the staircase. It was too soft for me to make out words, but I felt my skin break out in goosebumps. My stomach got tight and I stood up, determined to figure out the source. I approached the stairs slowly, stepping on each creaky step until I reached the second floor. There was no one there. The hallway was quiet, and I didn't hear that whisper again. I exhaled and realized my throat was dry. That night I tried to relax in the living room. The electricity in that room was working, so I turned on a low-watt lamp by the couch. The old couch smelled like mildew, but it was better than sitting in the dark. I was flipping through an old magazine I found in a drawer when I heard a thump above me. It sounded like it came from the attic. I hadn't been up there yet. The idea of going into the attic in this house made my heart race. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard another thump. It was louder this time, like something heavy dropped onto the floor. I grabbed my flashlight and headed upstairs again, adrenaline pushing me forward. There was a narrow door at the end of the second-floor hallway. It led to the attic steps. The door stuck a bit when I pulled on it, but it finally gave way. Dust the air, and the attic stairs creaked under my weight. The space was lit by a single weak bulb hanging from the rafters. I aimed my flashlight around. There were old trunks, crates, cobwebs everywhere, and a large mirror leaning against the wall near some boxes. I saw my reflection in the dirty glass. My face looked tense, and I could see sweat on my forehead even though the temperature was cold. I glanced around for anything that might have made the thump, but everything was still. Nothing was on the floor, and no boxes looked like they had fallen. I felt a wave of confusion. Then I spotted a weird shape in the mirror out of the corner of my eye. I turned, but it was gone. I shined my flashlight onto the mirror, and I only saw myself standing there, My pulse pounded and my eyes darted around the attic. No sign of anyone else. I left the attic as fast as I could. I closed that door behind me, hoping I wouldn't hear any more noises. In the early hours of the morning, I woke up drenched in sweat. My bedroom was freezing. The blankets barely did anything to keep me warm. I could hear a faint creaking sound in the hallway, like someone was gently rocking on a loose floorboard. Tightened, and I sat up, holding my breath. The door to my room was closed, but the noise was just on the other side. It moved from one end of the hallway to the other. I felt paralyzed. I stared at the doorknob, half expecting it to turn on its own. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. I sat there in the dark, my heart thudding. I waited, but it didn't come back. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, though it was restless and filled with unease. Over the next few days, I started to notice strange changes around the mansion. Chairs were a few inches away from where I left them. A small table in the foyer looked like it had shifted closer to the wall. One morning, I found my flashlight on the stairs when I was sure I had left it on the kitchen counter. Every time I tried to push these things out of my mind, something else happened. I heard faint whispers at odd times. I felt cold drafts in corners where there were no windows or vents. My heart raced almost constantly, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I would see someone standing behind me. But there was never anyone there. On the fifth night, the footsteps returned. This time they moved toward the attic door. I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and a heavy wrench from the kitchen, thinking I might need to defend myself if this was some intruder. I climbed the stairs, each step shaking under my feet, and I turned the knob to the attic door. It opened without a sound. I stepped in, shining my flashlight ahead. The single bulb still hung from the ceiling, casting weak light on the piles of boxes. The mirror was still leaning against the wall. I moved closer to it, shining the flashlight on the glass. My reflection stared back, tired and anxious. My hair was messed up, and my eyes looked bloodshot from lack of sleep. Then I noticed a dark shape to the side, just behind me in the reflection. It was disfigured, like it couldn't keep a solid form. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned around fast, wrench raised. There was nobody there. When I looked back at the mirror, the shape was gone. I felt a wave of dizziness, like my head was spinning. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my hands steady. I moved around the attic, checking behind boxes, looking under old chairs, but I found nothing. The mirror stayed where it was, leaning in the same position. I stood in front of it again, waiting, but the shape didn't appear. The only thing I heard was my own breathing. I flicked off the attic light and headed back downstairs. I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw. Over the following nights, I kept waking up at odd times. Each time, I heard whispers or footsteps. My entire body tense up and my heart would pound. My mouth went dry and I could barely swallow. I also noticed the mansion's corridors were always cold, as if some unseen presence was sucking the warmth out of the air. I started to sleep during the day just so I could keep watch at night. My eyes stung from exhaustion, but I couldn't rest properly anymore. This situation was becoming an obsession. I wanted to figure out what that shape was, why I only saw it in the mirror, and why it vanished when I turned around. I spent hours in the attic, sitting on a dusty stool, staring at the mirror. Sometimes I felt a rush of air behind me, but I never saw anything when I turned. If I kept my eyes on the reflection, I would catch a flicker of that shape, like a blurred silhouette in the corner. It gave me chills every time. My stomach would clench, and I'd break out into a sweat. It was always gone by the time I turned my head. After a while, I realized it seemed to appear when I was facing away, as though it only existed in the reflection. I tried different angles, different lights, even different times of night. A few times I whispered, "Who are you?" and waited. I never got a response I could understand. There were only faint sounds like distant footsteps or the scrape of something against the floorboards. My chest felt tight, and my breathing would speed up whenever I tried to talk to it. Sometimes I questioned my own sanity, but the physical reality of the cold air and the shifting furniture kept me convinced there was something real happening. After 2 weeks, the tension in the house started to wear me down. My hands shook when I tried to drink coffee in the mornings. I jumped at every small sound. At one point, I watched the coat rack in the foyer tilt as if someone pushed it. There was no draft, and I hadn't touched it. It just shifted, then settled back in place. My heart almost burst out of my chest. I rushed over to it looking for wires or anything else, but I found nothing. At night, the footsteps got louder, and the whispers were closer to my room. Sometimes they sounded right behind the door. I sat in bed, gripping my sheets, struggling to keep my breathing steady. My muscles were always tense, and I woke up with cramps in my shoulders and neck. I tried calling my friend who gave me the key, but he didn't answer. I felt isolated, like the mansion itself was cutting me off from the outside world. On the 20th night, I decided I had to confront whatever was in that mirror. I waited until I heard the footsteps pacing in the corridor. I grabbed my flashlight and walked up to the attic again. My heart hammered in my chest, and my throat felt dry. I entered the attic, turned on the light, and stood in front of the mirror. I forced myself to look directly into it. My breath came in short gasps. I whispered, "Show yourself." For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then I saw the shape appear behind me in the reflection. It was tall, hunched, and out of focus. My breath caught in my throat. The wrench slipped from my hand and clattered on the floor. I felt a rush of cold air around my shoulders. My skin prickled, and my eyes watered. It felt like every nerve in my body was on high alert. I forced myself not to turn around. My heart felt like it was going to explode. The shape seemed to shift. Its edges wavered. I clenched my fists and tried to speak again, but I couldn't get the words out. My mouth was too dry. Then the shape moved closer in the reflection, coming right up behind me, until it was only a few inches away from my back. My legs trembled, and my stomach lurched. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I could feel cold sweat dripping down my face. The overhead bulb flickered. I could see its movement in the glass, but I still couldn't turn. A wave of nausea hit me, and I nearly collapsed. Suddenly, the shape melted away, like it had never been there. My reflection was alone again. I dropped to my knees, breathing hard. My chest felt tight, and I pressed a hand against the floor to steady myself. My heart was racing so fast that I thought it would never slow down. After a while, I managed to stand up, grab my wrench, and leave the attic. I locked the attic door behind me, though I knew that wouldn't keep anything out. I spent the rest of that night in the living room, with every light on. I stared at the doorway, half expecting to see that shape standing there. By morning, I felt too drained to think straight, but I knew I had to figure out what it wanted. There was no way I could go on living like this. I searched the mansion, looking for old letters or anything that might explain the presence in the attic. I found a few dusty documents in a desk drawer, mostly receipts and deeds. Nothing mentioned a spirit or a hidden occupant. I wanted to find a simpler explanation, but I couldn't. On my last night in the mansion, I heard the steps again, and I knew they were heading to the attic. I followed them, my legs feeling shaky. I stood at the bottom of the attic stairs, and I heard a whisper that sounded like it was calling me up. My heart fluttered, but I forced myself to go. When I entered the attic, the light was already on. The mirror stood in the corner. My reflection waited in the glass. I approached it. My hands were sweating, and my breath came in shallow bursts. I didn't speak. I just stared. After a moment, the shape appeared behind me again. It moved in the same slow, uncertain way. I watched it raise what looked like an arm. My stomach churned. I could feel an iciness on my neck, like something was right behind me. I stood there, refusing to turn around. My body trembled. Then it vanished. The overhead bulb popped and went dark, leaving me in the glow of my flashlight. I stumbled out of the attic and slammed the door. I felt a surge of relief just being out of that space. I hurried down the stairs, packed my bag, and left that old mansion. I didn't care about finishing my stay. I felt like I was escaping with my sanity barely intact. I never went back to that place. I still don't know what that disfigured shape was or what it wanted. Sometimes I wonder if it followed me, but I haven't heard whispers or footsteps since I left. All I know is that mansion had something in it that I could see in the mirror, but never faced directly. Even now I get chills thinking about it. I don't tell this story to many people because most don't believe me. That's fine. I know what I heard and what I saw, and I know I'm never stepping foot in that house again. I got this clock last month. It came to me when my grandfather's lawyer sent me a letter saying there was an item in his estate that belonged to me. I expected some old piece of furniture or maybe a family photograph. Instead, I found a tall pendulum clock with a worn-out finish on its wooden case, a faded face, and a heavy metal pendulum inside. I set it up in my hallway because I thought it looked kind of impressive, even if it gave me a strange feeling. I noticed right away that it never seemed to stop, no matter how long I left it running. I didn't need to wind it as often as other clocks. It just kept going, ticking in a steady rhythm that filled the house at night. On the first evening, I went to bed around 11. I could hear the clock chime the usual times, 1, 2, 3, all the way until midnight. At midnight, it chimed 12 times. But I heard an extra chime right after the 12th, like a 13th strike. The sound was low and a bit off-key. I sat up in bed, confused. I reached for my phone, checked the time, and saw it was 12 o'clock on the dot. Still, the clock had given one extra ring that didn't make sense. I didn't think much of it right then. I thought maybe the gears were old and something misfired. I eventually drifted back to sleep. The rest of the night felt calm, and I didn't hear anything else. The next night, it happened again. But this time, right after the 13th chime, I heard a light creaking outside my bedroom. It was almost like someone brushing against the wall. My bedroom door was closed. I got up, turned on the lamp, and walked carefully toward the door. I listened for anything. I heard the faint swish of curtains in the living room. It was a soft sound, like fabric moving against the window frame. I wondered if a draft came through the old window, but I felt no breeze in the hallway. I went into the living room. The curtains were swaying, but the windows were shut. Nothing else seemed out of place. I felt uneasy, like someone else was in there with me. On the third night, I watched the clock around midnight. I wanted to see if that extra chime would happen again. At first, the minute hand approached 12 and the clock chimed normally. Then it delivered that 13th chime. I was right there, staring at it. The sound felt heavier than the other notes. Right after it echoed through the hallway, I heard something scrape against the floor in the living room. I rushed to check. I saw one of the chairs next to the dining table had moved, maybe a foot from where it usually sat. I looked around if I had left it like that, but I knew I hadn't. I felt my heart pounding. I checked all the windows again. They were closed. I didn't see a reason for that chair to move. On the fourth night, I tried to stay awake past midnight, but I ended up nodding off. At exactly midnight, I heard the clock's chimes wake me up. By the time it finished, I was wide awake in bed. Right after the 13th chime, I heard a louder sound, a dragging noise like a heavy piece of furniture scraping across the floor. I jumped out of bed and grabbed my phone for light. My hands were shaking and my throat felt tight. I followed the sound to the living room again. This time, a larger cabinet near the wall seemed to have shifted. It wasn't in the same spot. I reached out and touched it, and it was a bit crooked. I felt a cold sensation on my arms, like a drop in the temperature. My heart was beating so hard that I had trouble focusing on anything else. I realized I couldn't ignore this anymore. Something was moving around my house after that 13th chime. I decided to examine the clock the next morning in daylight. I got up early, made some coffee, and pulled the clock away from the wall to check its back panel. The wooden surface looked old and was covered in small symbols. They were carved in a way that suggested someone took a lot of time to etch them. They looked like circles, lines, and shapes that I couldn't recognize. I ran my fingers over them and felt grooves. The wood was smooth except for those carved spots, which were rough. Some of the lines formed a pattern that looked deliberate. I didn't know what it meant, but I got an uneasy feeling again, like I shouldn't be looking at them. I tried to see if there was any brand name or maker's mark, but all I saw were these odd symbols. I decided to check the inside of the clock, so I opened the case. The pendulum swung back and forth in a steady rhythm. It made a soft ticking sound that never stopped. I reached in and gently touched the pendulum. The metal was cool to the touch. Above it, the gears turned in a slow, constant cycle. I noticed more symbols on the inner panel. They looked similar to the ones on the back. This was no ordinary design. Something about the arrangement felt old and, honestly, a bit sinister, but I still didn't know what I was dealing with. That night I felt restless. I watched TV to distract myself, but I kept glancing at the clock. I heard the regular chimes every hour until midnight. The moment midnight struck, the clock chimed 12 times as always. Then it gave that strange 13th ring. Right after that, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They weren't loud, but they were distinct. My entire body tensed up. I got up from the couch, walked slowly into the hallway, and tried to see who might be there. I saw nobody, but I felt this pressure in my chest, like the air was heavier. The curtains in the front window swished back and forth as if someone walked by them. I rushed over and looked outside. Chairs slid a few inches across the floor, right in front of me. I backed away until I bumped into the wall. My breathing was shallow, and my hands felt sweaty. That was the first time I was certain something unseen was actually walking around. The following day, I tried to research the clock. I wanted to see if I could find any reference to a clock that chimed 13 times. I didn't find much. I looked through some old local antiques forums, but nothing seemed relevant. I considered calling an antiques dealer, but I was too embarrassed to mention the strange occurrences. Instead, I studied the symbols I had seen on the clock. I even tried sketching them. I typed keywords in search engines, but the results were random. I didn't find any direct information on these carvings or any mention of a 13th chime. I started to feel paranoid. I kept looking over my shoulder as if someone stood behind me. That evening, I stayed in the living room with the lights on. I set up my phone to record video around midnight. I wanted proof that something happened. The clock chimed 12 times, then gave the extra chime again. Right on cue, the temperature felt colder. The air on my arms felt like it dropped 10 degrees. My phone still pointed at the dining area. At first, I only heard a soft swish, then a scraping noise. I tried to hold still and focus on every detail. The chairs moved, the curtains fluttered, and I heard faint footsteps. I couldn't see anything or anyone. After a few seconds, I got so uncomfortable that I stood up and turned on every light in the house. The noises stopped. Everything settled. I walked over to my phone to stop the recording. My hands were shaking. When I played it back, I heard the scraping, the swish, and the footsteps, but I saw no figure. The furniture seemed to shift without any visible cause. I didn't know what to do with that. The next few days, I spent time carefully inspecting every part of the house. I checked the locks on the doors. I tried to see if there was some hidden mechanism that could explain the movement. I found nothing. I even put tape on the floor around the furniture to see if I could measure how far it moved each night. The next night, after that 13th chime, the chairs moved past the tape line by at least 6 inches. I felt a rush of fear each time it happened, like an electric jolt in my stomach. My breathing got tight, and my forehead broke out in sweat. I lost a lot of sleep. My mind was constantly on edge. Every small noise during the day made me jump. A week later, I noticed I sometimes felt a presence during the day as well. It was weaker, but I sensed it. I'd walk into the living room and feel a slight chill. The curtains would sway even though the windows were locked. The clock kept ticking, always in that steady rhythm. I tried once to remove the pendulum and stop it, but the clock wouldn't halt. The second I let go of the pendulum, it kept swinging on its own. That freaked me out more than anything else. I felt this surge of panic, and my heart pounded against my rib cage. I slammed the clock case shut and left the house to clear my head for a while. When I came back later that afternoon, I could swear the clock's ticking sounded louder. I stood there, feeling like the thing was looking at me somehow. My phone rang, and I nearly dropped it. It was just a neighbor asking if everything was okay. because they heard odd noises at night. I lied and said I might be rearranging furniture. I didn't want them to think I was losing my mind. After that call, I went to the clock and looked at the symbols again. I ran my finger across the carvings. Some lines had a repetitive pattern like a loop with points around it. I had no clue what they meant, but they looked ancient. My body felt tense, and I started